There's a photograph of Kensington Palace at night, warm light in the upstairs windows, and if you'd stood outside in the late 1960s, you might have assumed the woman behind those windows was surrounded by staff, by children, by one of the most famous surnames on earth. She wasn't. Princess Margaret was upstairs. Her husband was in the basement. One staircase separated them. She could hear him working, sawing, building, choosing to be anywhere in that house except beside her. The loneliest woman in the royal family wasn't alone. She was married. And the man she'd married, the man the whole country had celebrated as proof that love could survive inside the monarchy, had found a way to disappear without ever leaving the building. Before we follow how that disappearance began, if you value royal stories told with evidence rather than gossip, please like this video and subscribe. There's much more of the royal family's real history still to uncover. The question people still argue about is whether Margaret and Tony's love was ever real. Because the ending was so ugly, the affairs, the cruelty, the hidden notes, it's tempting to treat the whole marriage as a fraud from day one. The evidence doesn't support that. What it shows is something worse. Two people who genuinely loved each other, who couldn't keep their hands off each other in the early years, who shared humor and taste and physical warmth, and who slowly, methodically destroyed it all, not because the love was fake, because the things that made them fall in love were the same things that made the marriage impossible. To understand how that worked, we have to go back to the decision that shaped how Britain interpreted every relationship Margaret ever had. On 31 October 1955, Margaret announced she wouldn't marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. Her statement referred to the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and to her duty to the Commonwealth. Those words framed the decision through faith and duty, not as a command from her sister. The familiar version says the Queen simply refused permission, leaving Margaret with no choice. Government papers released decades later show something more complicated. Prime Minister Antony Armstrong-Jones and his advisors had considered a route that could have allowed Margaret to marry Townsend, keep her royal title and civil list income, but surrender her place in the succession. Changing the legal position would still have required political and Commonwealth consultation. The surviving papers also leave room for disagreement over exactly what Margaret knew and when. What isn't in doubt is that she made the final public decision herself. Years later, she gave Christopher Warwick one revealing explanation. How do you know when you've been apart from somebody for 2 years if you want to marry them? That doesn't sound like a woman eternally certain that one forbidden romance had been stolen from her. It sounds like someone admitting that separation had changed the answer. By 1958, Margaret was 27. She remained one of the most watched women in Britain, carrying out royal duties while living at Clarence House with the Queen Mother. No settled independent household, no clearly defined future beside the throne, and a press corps ready to turn every eligible man beside her into a possible husband. Warwick believed the deepest love of Margaret's early life was her father, George VI, whose death had taken the emotional center from her family before she was 22. Townsend mattered, but he wasn't the single key to every choice that followed. Then, at a small dinner in 1958, Margaret met a man who didn't behave as though meeting a princess was the most important thing that had ever happened to him, and that changed everything. People say, "This was what Tony introduced me to, but I was always interested in that." That was Margaret's correction to Christopher Warwick. The popular version makes Antony Armstrong-Jones the door through which a sheltered princess first entered Britain's creative life. Margaret rejected that story because it wasn't true. Long before Tony became her husband, Margaret's evenings revolved around music, theater, and dance. She played the piano, followed ballet seriously, and formed friendships with dancers, actors, and performers. In 1957, a year before the dinner that brought Tony into focus, she'd become the Royal Ballet's first president and received an honorary doctorate of music from the University of London. Tony didn't hand Margaret a new set of interests. He recognized interests already there. That distinction changes the attraction completely. A conventional aristocratic suitor knew how to bow, wait, and fit into the machinery around a king's daughter. Margaret had spent her life inside that machinery. Doors opened for her, but schedules, precedents, and household expectations arranged much of her day. A husband who treated royal approval as the center of his identity would have felt like one more person appointed to manage her. Tony arrived with work of his own. He moved through studios, dressing rooms, and theatrical circles with ease. His camera had already made him interesting before the palace noticed him, and his manner. De Courcy's account describes wit, quick talk and high spirits, wasn't the polished deference Margaret received as routine. Tony could tease her. He could disagree without first asking permission. To a woman surrounded by people trained to anticipate her rank, that lack of submission felt personal. He wasn't attending a princess. He was reacting to Margaret. There was a catch hidden inside the appeal. The qualities that made Tony seem different weren't costumes he could remove after the wedding. His work mattered to him. So did movement, privacy, and the right to decide where he went next. Margaret was drawn to a man who appeared impossible to manage, while hoping that love would make his independence compatible with life beside her. What made Tony feel liberating was precisely what would later make him impossible to contain. But before we follow that into the marriage, you have to understand who Tony actually was. Because the man Margaret fell for wasn't the shallow outsider the tabloids later tried to reduce him to. Taking photographs is a very nasty thing to do, Snowdon once said. He understood that a camera intrudes. His gift was making that intrusion feel like conversation. He disliked portraits that announced status before character. He built a career around the instant when a sitter stopped performing for the lens. Antony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones was born in London on 7 March 1930, the son of barrister Ronald Armstrong-Jones and Anne Messel. His parents' marriage broke down when he was very young. They divorced in 1935 and both remarried. Tony and his sister Susan moved between separate households rather than growing up inside one settled family home. At 16, while on holiday in Wales, he contracted polio. He spent about 6 months recovering in Liverpool Royal Infirmary. Accounts of that period record that neither parent visited. Susan did. The illness left his left leg shorter and weaker. The limp remained for life. At Cambridge, where he studied architecture, photography became more than an interest. Encouraged by his uncle, the stage designer Oliver Messel, he later apprenticed himself to the society photographer Baron. By 1952, he'd opened his own studio. Theater, fashion, and society work established his name, followed by commissions as an official royal photographer. This was no idle gentleman carrying a camera until marriage supplied him with status. Before Margaret's engagement was announced, Tony had photographed performers, designers, and members of the royal family, and his work appeared in leading magazines. Vogue praised him in 1960 for refusing to be overawed by famous names and persuading powerful sitters to be photographed his way. His method explains why. Tony didn't remain politely behind the lens. He moved around, talked, joked, changed a pose, adjusted a piece of clothing, and waited for the guarded face to loosen. The result looked less ceremonial and more alive. That informality required him to control the room, even when the person in front of him usually controlled everyone else. His later record deserves space too. He photographed poverty, deprivation, and disability with care, worked on wheelchair design, and in 1981 established the Snowdon Award Scheme to help disabled students. The present Snowdon Trust says he began it with £14,000 earned from photographing the royal family. It's a lasting part of his life, and one reason this story can't flatten him into a list of betrayals. He'd learned to make powerful people lower their guard. Princess Margaret was about to discover just how disarming that could feel. "It will be too sad if you cannot come." Margaret wrote that line to Tony in October 1958, inviting him to lunch at Clarence House. Behind it, something private was already taking shape. Their paths had crossed before. On 21 April 1956, Tony photographed the wedding of Lady Anne Coke and Colin Tennant at Holkham. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were among the guests. That places them at the same event, but it doesn't prove a romance began there. The encounter that mattered came in 1958, at a small dinner given by Margaret's lady-in-waiting, Lady Elizabeth Cavendish. Even then, Anne de Courcy writes, they didn't immediately click. A few months later, one of Margaret's admirers arranged for Tony to photograph her. That's when the balance changed. Inside a sitting, Tony held the authority. De Courcy records that he politely told Margaret to change her clothes, jewelry, and pose while he talked about mutual friends and the theatrical figures he'd photographed. She was used to rooms adjusting themselves around her. Here, she adjusted for him. He wasn't rude, and he didn't ignore her rank. He simply worked as though the picture mattered more than ceremony. That gave him access to something courtiers rarely saw. Margaret concentrating, responding, and allowing another person to lead. She wanted him in her circle. He began appearing in the small groups with whom she attended theaters and dinners. Because he wasn't known as an escort, the extra man attracted little attention. That anonymity became protection. Their courtship was conducted with remarkable discipline. De Courcy describes Margaret's car leaving her near Tony's Pimlico studio, where she could enter away from the main road. Friends' houses gave them privacy. His professional commissions gave his visits a reason. Only a narrow circle knew what those meetings had become. Fleet Street, alert to every titled man beside Margaret, failed to identify the working photographer already close to her. Photographer became friend. Friend became trusted companion. Trusted companion became lover, while the public looked elsewhere. Their connection rested on shared humor, restless energy, and a love of performance. But its sharpest attraction was simpler. Tony paid close attention without behaving as though obedience was the price of being near her. Margaret could feel seen without feeling handled. By the summer of 1959, they were deeply in love. But people close to them were already wondering whether Tony intended to stand still at all. And the warnings that came next should have told Margaret exactly what was ahead. You won't always know where he is. He won't always tell you where he is. Christopher Warwick said, Lady Elizabeth Cavendish gave Margaret that warning before the wedding. Lady Elizabeth wasn't a distant court official. She was Margaret's lady-in-waiting, a close friend, and the hostess who'd brought Tony into her company. According to Warwick's account, Margaret answered, No, of course it won't matter. It would matter enormously. Another concern entered the written record through Harold Nicholson. In his diary, Nicholson noted that Sir Alan Lascelles, the experienced royal courtier, worried that Tony's varied and sometimes wild private life carried a continuing risk of scandal and slander. That's contemporary evidence that anxiety existed inside court circles before the wedding, not after. Tony received a warning from his own side. In the recollection Anne de Courcy recorded, his father, Ronald Armstrong-Jones, wrote, Boy, you would be mad to marry Princess Margaret. It will ruin your career. The fear was almost the reverse of Lady Elizabeth's. Margaret was being warned that Tony wouldn't be contained by royal marriage. Tony was being warned that royal marriage would contain him. Then there was what the warnings didn't mention, because not everyone knew. De Courcy's research identifies Jackie Chan as Tony's long-term girlfriend and Gina Ward as another woman involved with him during the period when his bond with Margaret was becoming serious. Chan had noticed his unexplained absences. Ward was stunned when he told her he was marrying the princess. De Courcy also connects Tony to Camilla Fry, the wife of his close friend Jeremy Fry. Decades later, DNA testing established that Tony was the biological father of Camilla's daughter Polly, born just 22 days after the royal wedding. That last fact redefines what we now know about Tony's overlapping attachments, but it doesn't tell us what Margaret knew during the courtship. Polly's paternity emerged publicly decades after the honeymoon. A secret can shape a marriage without both spouses knowing its full dimensions. What Margaret did understand, because Lady Elizabeth told her directly, was Tony's fierce need for movement and his resistance to reporting his whereabouts. What she underestimated was the emotional cost of accepting that freedom once he was her husband. Neither warning made marriage impossible. Both exposed the bargain. Margaret expected love to make uncertainty bearable. Tony expected marriage to leave the core of his life untouched. Both had been warned. Neither warning could compete with what they believed the marriage would give them. And then came the question of why Margaret said yes when she did. Because the timing has been used to tell a very different story. I received a letter from Peter in the morning, and that evening I decided to marry Tony. Margaret later gave that striking account to Jonathan Aitken. It's often been turned into a tidy revenge story. Townsend announced his marriage, Margaret chose the nearest available man, and a royal engagement followed. The chronology is more complicated. Tony first stayed at Balmoral in early October 1959. During that visit, Margaret received Townsend's letter telling her he intended to marry Marie-Luce Jamagne. Anne de Courcy's reconstruction says, Margaret told Tony about it on a walk and warned him not to propose at that moment. Their relationship was already serious. By the summer, de Courcy's sources considered them deeply in love. That leaves two accounts with different emphasis. Margaret's words to Aitken make the letter sound decisive. De Courcy's chronology places the settled decision to marry closer to Christmas, after a courtship that had developed for more than a year. Townsend's news mattered, but it didn't create Margaret's feelings for Tony, and it doesn't prove she accepted him solely to retaliate against a former love. By Christmas, the couple had decided. De Courcy says their engagement took place while staying with Jeremy and Camilla Fry, and that Tony sought the Queen's approval over the holiday period. The Queen consented, but the public announcement had to wait. The Queen's pregnancy came first. Prince Andrew was born on 19 February 1960. 1 week later, on Friday 26 February, Clarence House announced that Princess Margaret would marry Antony Armstrong-Jones. The secrecy had worked. Even members of the household reportedly asked who he was. Newspapers that had paired Margaret with wealthy, titled escorts had missed the man carrying a camera. The ring made the news story visible, a ruby surrounded by diamonds in a flower-like setting, designed around a rose for Margaret Rose. Personal, modern, unlike the plain political match many people expected. To the public, the meaning looked simple. Margaret had survived the Townsend heartbreak. She'd moved forward. She'd chosen talent and work over a conventional aristocratic name. Britain saw a princess stepping into the new decade beside a man who seemed to belong to it. But the engagement hadn't closed anything. It had opened a door, and the public was about to project a meaning onto this wedding that two human beings could never sustain. The doting millions were electrified and delighted. That was Life magazine's description of the reaction. The phrase captures more than excitement about a wedding. Britain thought it was watching an old institution make room for a different kind of future. The symbolism arrived before the ceremony. Margaret carried history in her name, King George VI's younger daughter, the only sister of the reigning queen, a princess whose private choices had already become matters of national argument. Tony arrived from another direction. No title, no court appointment, a living earned behind a camera. Yet calling him an ordinary outsider would be misleading. He came from Welsh gentry, was the son of a barrister and a society hostess, and had attended Eton and Cambridge. What made him unusual wasn't poverty or social exclusion. It was his profession, his manner, and the independent world he'd built before the palace noticed him. That difference gave newspapers an irresistible contrast. On one side, royal ceremony, inherited rank, the household that had shaped Margaret since childhood. On the other, studios, magazine commissions, actors, designers, and theater people. Tony could move between both worlds, but he belonged wholly to neither. The timing deepened the meaning. Britain remembered the long public strain surrounding Townsend. Many people had watched Margaret renounce that marriage and kept a protective affection for her ever since. Tony's arrival allowed them to rewrite the ending. The lonely princess had found love. Duty hadn't taken everything. Modern Britain had offered her another chance. But that hope placed a burden on two people who hadn't yet shared an ordinary Tuesday. Before they'd established the small habits of marriage, who waited, who yielded, who came home, who accepted being left, the public had made them symbols. Margaret represented emotional recovery. Tony represented a loosening of class and royal convention. Together, they were expected to prove that love could reconcile freedom with duty. If the marriage failed, it wouldn't just be private disappointment. It would seem to undo the hopeful meaning Britain had attached to it. By the morning of 6 May 1960, Britain wasn't merely watching two people marry. It was watching a national story reach the ending it wanted. Whether the marriage could survive being anyone's symbol, that was the part no one had thought about yet. Friday, 6 May 1960, began with the kind of public order royalty does best. Crowds gathered along the London route. Television cameras took their positions. Inside Westminster Abbey, approximately 2,000 invited guests waited beneath a building already crowded with royal memory. Margaret traveled from Clarence House in the glass coach with Prince Philip. Her father had been dead for 8 years, so it was her brother-in-law who accompanied her and gave her away. That absence sat quietly inside the ceremony. The daughter who'd adored George VI was entering marriage without him beside her. She wore a white silk organza gown designed by Norman Hartnell. Clean lines, no heavy decoration. The full skirt, veil, and Margaret herself carried the picture. Above the veil stood the Poltimore tiara, the Victorian diamond piece she'd bought rather than borrowed from the royal collection. Thoroughly royal, but with choices that were recognizably her own. At the altar waited the untitled photographer, whose name much of the household had learned only weeks earlier. The marriage service was led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, with the Dean of Westminster, Eric Abbott. The couple made the same public promises expected of any bride and groom. Around them, rank remained visible in every seat, procession, and form of address. This was the first royal wedding broadcast on television. More than 20 million people are commonly reported to have watched in Britain. A worldwide figure of 300 million has been widely repeated. though it should be treated as an estimate rather than a precise measurement. What can't be doubted is the reach. For the first time, viewers across many countries could watch a British royal marriage unfold live rather than encounter it later through photographs and cinema newsreels. After the service came the familiar release, the procession, the Buckingham Palace balcony, the cheering crowds, a wedding breakfast inside the palace. Margaret smiled beside her husband. Tony stood inside the royal family's frame. The story appeared settled. Then the newlyweds departed for a 6-week honeymoon through the Caribbean aboard the royal yacht Britannia. But the ceremony had settled none of the questions already waiting for them. Could Tony remain a working photographer without his assignments repeatedly taking him away? Could Margaret accept those absences once freedom became loneliness? Could a husband preserve an independent voice inside a hierarchy where his wife entered every room before him? The vows were public and sincere. The terms each person silently attached to them were private, and they weren't the same. They could hardly keep their hands off each other. That's how one friend described Margaret and Tony's early relationship to Anne de Courcy. That testimony matters because the ending can distort everything that came before it. Once you know about the affairs, the cruelty, and the hidden notes, it's tempting to treat the wedding as the first scene of a fraud. De Courcy's evidence doesn't support that. In the early years, Margaret and Tony were genuinely affectionate. They shared a sense of humor sharp enough to keep pace with each other, and friends remembered how easily one could make the other laugh. Their interests met. Ballet and theater weren't duties to be endured. Both enjoyed them. They swam, traveled, water-skied, sunbathed, and sought the company of people who made, performed, or argued about art. Their home at Kensington Palace made that partnership visible. Historic royal palaces records that the Snowdons created fashionable interiors and entertained celebrity guests, pop stars, and artists. De Courcy describes their drawing room as a meeting point between the arts and the establishment. Writers, painters, dancers, actors, and public figures crossing the same carpet. Margaret brought royal position and her friendships. Tony brought colleagues, visual curiosity, and an ease with people who might never have entered a conventional royal salon. Tony photographed Margaret repeatedly, and his portraits didn't always present her as a distant royal figure. He understood how she held her head when her expression became guarded, and how to wait until the formal face softened. She, in turn, allowed her husband an access few photographers received. One famous portrait, often placed during the courtship, was actually taken in 1967, well inside the marriage. Getting that date right matters. It shows that artistic connection could remain even while other parts of the relationship were weakening. In public, they looked matched. Young, stylish, at ease amid film premieres, theater nights, and foreign travel. Photographers liked them because they didn't resemble a stiff ceremonial pairing. None of that cancels the warning signs. But it proves that Margaret didn't knowingly enter an empty arrangement and then complain that it contained no warmth. She entered a relationship rich in affection, laughter, physical attraction, and shared taste. Tony did too. They had something real to lose. And they were about to start losing it, because Tony was discovering that loving Margaret and becoming part of the monarchy were two entirely different commitments. He didn't want to be Mr. Princess Margaret. Christopher Warwick used that blunt phrase to describe Tony's resistance to life as a royal consort. He admired the Queen, charmed the Queen Mother, and could function smoothly inside royal company. What he resisted was becoming visible only as the man walking behind his wife. Protocol made the imbalance physical. At official engagements, Margaret took precedence. Tony followed. He was expected to look attentive, avoid contradicting her in public, and support a program built around her duties. Those rules reflected her position as the sovereign's sister, not a personal insult. But for a man accustomed to directing studios and deciding how powerful sitters would be seen, deference could feel like professional disappearance. Tony's answer was work. Marriage hadn't made his camera a hobby. Assignments gave him decisions that were his alone: whom to photograph, where to travel, when to release the shutter. His working life protected a part of him the monarchy didn't own. His position changed on 6 October 1961, when he was created Earl of Snowdon and Viscount Linley. The titles placed him more securely within Britain's hereditary system. Tony was no longer the untitled photographer standing beside a princess. He was Lord Snowdon. But a title couldn't replace an occupation. The National Portrait Gallery records that he worked for the Sunday Times from 1962 until 1990. and for Vogue from 1964. His range widened beyond society portraiture, magazine assignments, film, design, projects concerned with people whose lives rarely appeared in royal photography. His design work made the point sharply. With architect Cedric Price and engineer Frank Newby, he helped create the modern aviary at London Zoo, opened in 1964. Useful, inventive work attached to his own name. That same independence later entered Parliament. In 1972, his maiden speech in the Lords addressed obstacles disabled people faced in daily life. The title therefore solved one problem, while leaving the dangerous one untouched. Margaret wanted a husband who participated in the life her rank required. Engagements, dinners, household routines, and the private return home afterward. Tony wanted a marriage spacious enough to preserve work, movement, and control. Every assignment that confirmed Tony's identity could feel to Margaret like another decision in which she came second. Every request that he remain beside her could feel to Tony like proof that the institution intended to absorb him. The harder she sought contact, the more fiercely he defended his space. The more he withdrew, the more urgently she wanted proof that she still mattered. And into this fragile balance came the one thing that was supposed to fix everything. David Albert Charles Armstrong-Jones was born on 3 November 1961. Because Tony had been created Earl of Snowdon weeks earlier, the baby was styled Viscount Linley. He was Margaret's first child, a grandson of King George VI, and another line of continuity within the royal family. For the public, his arrival seemed to confirm the promise of the wedding: a princess, an unconventional husband, and now a son. Photographs presented the three of them as a secure young family, Margaret composed and proud, Tony attentive, David protected between them. Those images were real moments. But a photograph can establish that a family exists. It can't certify everything happening inside the marriage around it. Motherhood added a new center to Margaret's private life. The royal family's record describes her as a devoted mother, and David's later recollections support a picture richer than formal nursery appearances. Margaret exposed him to music, ballet, art, and well-made objects. She took him to factories and encouraged him to look closely at craftsmanship. When he later chose furniture making as a profession, she defended the choice, attended his schools and exhibitions, and supported the work. Her pride wasn't confined to his title. Tony's involvement had a different texture. Designing and making were very much part of my childhood, visiting factories with my mother and making things with my father, David said decades later. Tony's workshop in the basement of Kensington Palace became part laboratory, part classroom. David remembered making things beside him. Tony taught him to draw and work with clay, encouraged the pleasure of understanding how an object was built. That wasn't ceremonial fatherhood. It was time, instruction, and shared curiosity. But Tony's career didn't pause. Photography remained demanding, and new design work widened the number of places where his attention could go. Margaret was adapting to motherhood while learning that a baby didn't make her husband's professional restlessness disappear. The Snowdons could function as a family. They could love their son, teach him, photograph him, plan around him. None of that proved the marriage beneath those shared responsibilities felt secure. David gave them a shared devotion, but a child can't settle an argument over what each parent believes a marriage requires. And then, while Margaret was pregnant with their second child, the first clear evidence arrived that the strain had become something more serious. His behavior had to change because it was distressing her. Christopher Warwick said those were the terms of a warning delivered to Tony by Margaret's gynecologist while she was pregnant with their second child. According to Warwick's account, the doctor feared Margaret's distress could affect the pregnancy. That testimony comes from Warwick's later biographical account, not an official medical file. What it establishes is that someone close enough to observe Margaret's condition believed the marital strain had become a health concern, not just an inconvenience, but a risk. Lady Sarah Frances Elizabeth Armstrong-Jones was born at Kensington Palace on 1 May 1964. Her safe arrival made David a brother and completed the family portrait. 4 people together, the picture the public wanted to see. Warwick believed the doctor's intervention may have changed Tony's conduct for a time. Other accounts also show periods of renewed closeness. Margaret and Tony didn't move in a straight line from wedding to estrangement. They argued, returned to each other, traveled together, and sometimes recovered the ease that had defined their courtship. The clearest public high point came during their American visit in November 1965. They traveled through California, Arizona, Washington, and New York, drawing crowds and press attention. At the White House, President Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson hosted them for dinner and dancing. Photographs show Margaret dancing with the president and Tony moving confidently through the same rooms. Warwick described the visit as being kind of like a second honeymoon. Away from the ordinary pressures of Kensington Palace, the couple had movement, attention, shared engagements, and a fresh setting. Their public and private energies worked in the same direction, for a while. One modern drama turns the White House evening into a financial rescue, with Margaret charming Johnson into helping Britain. That's entertainment, not history. Warwick found no basis for claiming Margaret negotiated a bailout. Financial discussions were already taking place through governments and officials. The American success belongs in the marriage story for a different reason. It shows the cycle that made the Snowdons so difficult to read from outside. Conflict could be followed by genuine reunion. Reunion produced convincing public renewal. Then the setting changed, the applause ended, and the older pattern returned. The marriage could still recover for weeks at a time. Then Tony would go downstairs to work, and Margaret would once again wait above him. That image, Margaret upstairs, Tony in the basement, wasn't a metaphor. It was their actual life. Apartment 1A at Kensington Palace looked like a private home, but it remained a royal residence. Its rooms carried the formal weight of the institution, even when filled with the Snowdons' children, friends, and music. Down in the basement, Tony had something different, a workroom where the rules were his. Anne de Courcy described the pattern after repeated interviews with Snowdon and people close to him. His professional assignments could keep him away for most of the day. When he returned, he might go straight downstairs and begin making something, a bookcase perhaps, or a copper hood for the kitchen. Margaret remained above, and if she came down seeking his company, de Courcy reports she could quickly be sent back upstairs. For Tony, that workroom wasn't a hobby he could put aside when palace life became inconvenient. It was proof that marriage hadn't swallowed his identity. Inside that basement, he was still the photographer, maker, and designer who answered to his own judgment. A closed door gave him control. For Margaret, that closed door carried a devastating meaning. She didn't need another member of staff. She needed her husband to choose to be with her. An equerry could organize a diary. A lady-in-waiting could accompany an engagement. Relatives could telephone. Servants could fill the rooms. Crowds could call her name. None of them could provide the reassurance she wanted from Tony. She wasn't without people. She was emotionally excluded by the one person whose presence mattered most, sometimes while only a staircase separated them. And there was a bitter irony in the architecture itself. The palace apartment had roughly 20 rooms spread across 4 floors, enough space for receptions, nurseries, guests, and staff. But abundance didn't create intimacy. It let separation acquire its own architecture. Tony didn't have to leave the building to become unavailable. Margaret didn't have to sit in an empty house to feel abandoned. His nearness made the refusal of company unmistakable. Every trip down the stairs risked another rejection. Silence might have been easier. At least silence could be misunderstood. The sound of sawing from the basement couldn't be. That was the private ache behind one of Britain's grandest addresses. And if the evening showed the distance between them, the argument over where to build a country house was about to show something worse, that Tony had stopped asking Margaret's permission altogether. They agreed on one thing: Kensington Palace wasn't enough. However grand apartment 1A appeared, it belonged to the crown. Both wanted a country place that felt personal. Then their agreement stopped. The Queen offered a site near Sunninghill, close to Windsor and to the family around whom Margaret's life had always been arranged. Margaret could see a house built for their needs, near the people she trusted. It wouldn't cut her off from royal life. It would extend it. Tony wanted Old House, a small, neglected property connected to the Nymans estate in West Sussex. He'd known the place since childhood. It belonged to his family's landscape, not to the Windsor's world. Where Margaret saw practical problems, Tony saw memory, freedom, and possibility. The practical problems were real. Anne de Courcy writes that Old House couldn't easily accommodate Margaret's maid and protection officer. A public right-of-way ran uncomfortably close to the drawing room windows. Margaret also said the house was haunted. Then Margaret discovered something that cut deeper than any ghost. According to de Courcy, Tony had brought in a builder and begun the refurbishment, without her. He hadn't persuaded his wife. He'd moved ahead without her agreement. That act mattered more than plumbing, privacy, or location. A shared home is usually a statement of a shared future. Old House announced a future Tony could create on his own authority. Margaret could visit it, but she hadn't helped choose it. Tony went there whenever he could. It became a workshop, a retreat, and a place where he entertained his friends. De Courcy's reporting also places some of his other relationships there. Its distance from palace routine was part of its appeal. Old House allowed him to be host, maker, and master of the timetable, not the man walking behind a princess. Even the proposed houses had faced different emotional directions. Sunninghill looked toward the Windsor family Margaret knew. Old House looked backward to Tony's childhood and outward to friends he chose for himself. Neither dream was false. The damage came when only one of them became bricks, rooms, and a finished unilateral decision. Once Tony had a house that felt entirely his, Margaret began to understand just how much of his life existed beyond her reach. And that life was about to become far more complicated than she knew. Start before the wedding. De Courcy's interviews and reporting identify two women still emotionally involved with Tony during the secret courtship, Jackie Chan and Gina Ward. Marriage didn't close every other door. Later came Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs, whose family lived near Tony's Sussex retreat. The clearest scene comes directly through De Courcy's research. When Tony entered the London clinic for an operation, Margaret found Jacqueline beside his bed. Margaret later told a friend she could have nursed him herself. She'd even earned a nursing badge as a Girl Guide. It's an almost painfully modest response from a woman routinely surrounded by deference. She wasn't asking to command the hospital. She was saying that the intimate role of caring for her husband had already been occupied by someone else. That's why the incident can't be reduced to jealousy. Margaret had spent years seeking Tony's presence. Now, when he was vulnerable, another woman had access to him in the place a wife might naturally expect to stand. The discovery told her that exclusion operated not only in his work, but in his private affections. Speaking to De Courcy about former girlfriends and overlapping attachments, Tony himself described his approach as serial and simultaneous. That phrase doesn't verify every story told about him, but it supports the broader pattern reported by named women and biographical witnesses. De Courcy's evidence also gives us Polly Fry, born 28 May 1960, 22 days after the royal wedding. She grew up believing Jeremy Fry was her father. In 2004, she said a DNA test had established that Snowdon was her biological father. He initially denied reports of a test, then later acknowledged the truth. That means Tony had conceived a child with Camilla Fry during the period he was courting Margaret, but we can't place 21st century knowledge into Margaret's mind. Polly's paternity emerged publicly decades after the honeymoon. The standard stays consistent. What we know now redefines Tony's overlapping attachments. It doesn't prove Margaret knew every hidden detail. A secret can reshape a marriage without both partners seeing its full shape. And if Tony's divided life was placing strain on the marriage from one side, his behavior inside the home was doing something worse from the other. Tony's wit had once felt like freedom. He could puncture ceremony, make Margaret laugh, speak to her without the syrupy flattery that followed a princess everywhere. That same speed of mind would later be used to make her smaller. De Courcy's interviewees described put-downs disguised as jokes, mimicking Margaret while she sang, correcting her before guests, ignoring her request for a drink, or leaving her exposed at the end of a public entrance. Each act could look trivial when separated from the others. Together, they created an atmosphere where she couldn't know when affection would turn into ridicule. Lady Glenconner, who saw the couple at close range, recalled something harder to dismiss. Tony left notes for Margaret to find, in drawers, among her belongings. They listed faults or attacked her appearance. One remembered note used an anti-Semitic insult and ended with a declaration of hatred. Repeating the full wording would give the cruelty another performance. What matters is that it was written, hidden, and left for his wife to discover alone. De Courcy also reports an argument so fierce that the Queen Mother withdrew with her page rather than remain within hearing. Margaret wasn't gentle in every quarrel. Accounts from both sides describe her possessiveness and her insistence on knowing where Tony was. She could pull rank when frustrated. She could remind him, directly or through a cutting remark, that his standing came through marriage to her. Living with her demands could be exhausting. But balance doesn't require pretending every injury was identical. Wanting control and humiliating a spouse aren't interchangeable acts. A cutting joke before guests forced Margaret into a trap, object, and she looked humorless, smile, and the insult passed as entertainment. A hidden note removed even that choice. No guest could interrupt, no relative could soften the moment, and Tony didn't have to watch her read it. The method made humiliation both public and intensely private, depending on what would hurt most. Her rank couldn't protect her from that message. In some ways, it made the humiliation harder to reveal. A princess who admitted that her husband could reduce her to tears risked being told she was dramatic, spoiled, or simply unaccustomed to contradiction. So the public woman remained formidable. The private woman began looking elsewhere for reassurance, and what she found would eventually be used to destroy her, while Tony's behavior stayed invisible. By now, you've seen that Margaret's loneliness didn't come from being physically alone. It grew while her husband was often only a staircase away. How do you see it? Were they simply incompatible, or had Tony's independence become something crueler? Tell me in the comments. And if you value royal history built on evidence rather than tabloid gossip, please like this video and subscribe, because the photographs that changed everything are still ahead. The first name that must be handled carefully is Anthony Barton. He wasn't a passing stranger. Barton had known Tony at Cambridge, moved within the couple's circle, and became godfather to their daughter Sarah. Christopher Warwick and Anne de Courcy both place a brief relationship between Barton and Margaret in 1966. That closeness is often presented as revenge, as though Margaret selected one of Tony's friends to wound him. The surviving record establishes the relationship far more securely than it establishes a single motive. Loneliness, anger, attraction, and retaliation may all be proposed by biographers. They can't be measured from the outside. De Courcy's account adds an uncomfortable turn. Barton left one of Margaret's letters where his wife Eva found it. Eva later told Tony. Biographical witnesses remembered Tony as deeply upset, despite his own overlapping relationships. He could demand freedom for himself and still experience her choice as betrayal. Margaret, meanwhile, had crossed a boundary with someone embedded in their shared circle. That hurt was real, on both sides. Later came Robin Douglas Home, a writer, pianist, and nephew of former Prime Minister Alec Douglas Home. Music made their closeness easy to understand. He played, Margaret sang, and both knew the social setting where she could relax. When talk of an affair spread, Margaret maintained the relationship had been platonic. Letters attributed to her and later sold have been described as emotionally intimate. Emotional intimacy, however, isn't laboratory proof of a physical relationship. The accurate language is that they were close, their correspondence carried strong feeling, and accounts differ on whether the bond became sexual. Douglas Home suffered from depression and died by suicide in 1968. His death can't responsibly be assigned to Margaret. Depression has its own medical and personal history, and no surviving letter gives an outsider permission to reduce a man's death to one woman or one relationship. Chronology isn't causation. Other famous men, Mick Jagger, Peter Sellers, Warren Beatty, have been inserted into lists that grow each time they're copied. Association, a party, or an uncorroborated anecdote isn't evidence of an affair. Those names add heat, not understanding. The evidence shows something sadder. By the middle of the 1960s, both Margaret and Tony were seeking affection and validation outside a marriage that had once supplied both. These connections may have eased loneliness for a time, but they didn't settle what Margaret believed marriage, faith, and family required of her. She was willing to look elsewhere for comfort. She wasn't willing to leave. And to understand why, you have to understand what divorce meant to her, not what it means to us now. Margaret was a lifelong Anglican. In 1955, she'd publicly placed the church's teaching on the permanence of Christian marriage before her personal wishes. Those words had become part of her public identity. Ending her own marriage would force her to live inside a contradiction the country could quote back to her. That didn't make divorce impossible in law. It made it costly in conscience. Then there were David and Sarah. Separation could alter daily life. Divorce would make the rupture permanent. Legal and global news. Margaret had to weigh her own relief against consequences she believed her children would bear. For years, the couple lived in the space between marriage and departure. There were trips intended to repair the bond, spells of renewed affection, shared friends and family occasions that allowed them to function together again. Some recoveries were real. None removed the fundamental fight over presence, freedom, and control. There was also no reassuring royal model in front of her. Divorce existed across Britain, but within Margaret's immediate role it still carried the shadow of constitutional memory, church teaching, and public scandal. Her sister wasn't merely a relative to consult. The Queen was supreme governor of the Church of England and head of the institution Margaret represented. That didn't mean Elizabeth ordered her to remain married. It meant Margaret couldn't treat the decision as wholly private. Staying wasn't proof that Margaret was content, blind, or incapable of acting. It showed how high she believed the price of leaving would be. Faith, duty, motherhood, pride, and fear of public failure were wound together. No single one explains her decision. Together, they made endurance feel safer than a final break. But that endurance depended on believing her family understood what was happening inside the marriage. The difficulty was that the Tony Margaret described wasn't always the Tony her family met. In royal company, Snowdon knew exactly how to behave. He was attentive, amusing, and precise about etiquette. He addressed the Queen correctly, observed the expected courtesies, and could move from conversation with the Queen Mother to easy rapport with Prince Philip or Prince Charles. He didn't look like a man resisting the family. He looked remarkably at home in it. Margaret gave Warwick her own explanation. Tony, she said, was very oily, with my sister and with my mother and the family. That charm had consequences. If Tony arrived warm, respectful, and funny, complaints about his coldness at home were harder for others to reconcile with the man before them. The Queen Mother had become fond of him. The Queen saw a brother-in-law who handled protocol well. They could judge only the behavior available to them. Warwick later said that people tended to blame Margaret when the marriage failed. Her reputation made that judgment easy. She was known for rank, exacting standards, and a sharp tongue. If one spouse appeared charming and the other already carried the label difficult, the simplest verdict wrote itself. But simple wasn't true. Tony could be genuinely affectionate with the family and still be absent or merciless with his wife. Margaret could be demanding and still accurately describe mistreatment. The version seen at a family lunch didn't cancel the version witnesses encountered during a marital row. For Margaret, the distinction could feel like disbelief. Tony could withdraw downstairs, vanish into work, or turn a joke against her, then appear before her closest relatives as the polished man they enjoyed. If she protested, she risked confirming every old criticism about being possessive, spoiled, or impossible to please. That was another form of isolation. Her husband wasn't only elsewhere, his most agreeable self seemed available to everyone except her. And the family whose understanding she needed couldn't fully see the private marriage from the public rooms. The marriage had given Margaret a husband, 2 children, and a public title. What she needed now was one place where she didn't have to explain why she felt alone. She was about to find it in a wedding gift that would become the most famous island in royal history. The place Margaret chose as her refuge had begun as a celebration of the marriage she was escaping. During the Snowdons' Caribbean honeymoon in 1960, their friend Colin Tennant offered Margaret a wedding present. He'd acquired Mystique, then a sparsely developed island in the Grenadines, and gave her a parcel of land on its southern headland. The gift wasn't a completed villa. It was ground she could shape for herself. That distinction mattered. Kensington Palace was magnificent, but it belonged to the crown. Balmoral, Sandringham, and the other royal homes were family places governed by established rhythms. Margaret later described her Mystique land as the only property she truly owned, the small part of the world where occupation didn't depend on her position as the Queen's sister. The house became Les Jolies Eaux, the beautiful waters. Its designer was Oliver Messel, Tony's uncle, whose theater work and Caribbean architecture gave the villa its open, elegant character. By the early 1970s, Margaret had a home there that looked towards sea and sky rather than palace courtyards. The connection to Tony made the emotional irony sharper. His uncle designed it. Their friend had given the land to mark their wedding, yet the house gradually became associated with the hours Margaret spent away from her husband. A marital gift had turned into private territory. De Courcy reports that Tony called Mystique mistake. The nickname was dismissive, but it also exposed the distance between them. He had Old House in Sussex, a retreat tied to his childhood, work, and friends. Margaret had an island property where his judgment didn't define the atmosphere. Mystique loosened the structure surrounding her. Days weren't arranged around audiences, official calls, or the precise machinery of a royal household. She could swim, garden, sing, entertain friends, and appear less guarded. That freedom shouldn't be confused with isolation. Margaret didn't go there to live like a hermit. She went there to decide who entered her time. The villa wasn't just a holiday address. It was the one home where royal ownership and emotional ownership felt close to the same thing. Colin Tennant's gift had been intended to honor Margaret and Tony together. Years later, It gave Margaret the room to build a life that functioned without him. And then Margaret brought to this island, created from her wedding gift, the man who'd be blamed for ending her marriage. Roddy Llewellyn didn't enter Margaret's life on mystique. Their first meeting came in Scotland in September 1973, through friends who understood how unhappy her private life had become. Anne and Colin Glenconner were holding a gathering at their Scottish home. A place needed filling, and Lady Glenconner helped bring Roddy into the group. Her later recollections are important. She rejected the dramatic suggestion that she'd deliberately found a lover for Margaret. Roddy was invited to make up the numbers. What followed belonged to Margaret and Roddy, not to a scheme arranged around them. Margaret was 43, Roddy was 25. That 17-year difference would eventually dominate nearly every newspaper description of him. But age tells you very little about why his company mattered. Roderick Llewellyn was the younger son of Sir Harry Llewellyn, the equestrian who'd helped Britain win Olympic show-jumping gold in 1952. Roddy trained in horticulture and built a working identity around plants. He later became known as a garden designer, author, journalist, and broadcaster. He wasn't the unemployed young escort suggested by hostile coverage. People who met him described a manner very different from Tony's sharper edge. Biographer Theo Aronson called him well-mannered, well-spoken, amusing, and above all, sweet-natured. Those words explain why Margaret, after years of silences and ridicule, might have found his gentleness restful. Margaret herself called it a loving friendship. Warwick, who discussed the relationship with her, believed Roddy gave Margaret affection and, as she understood it, love. They shared an interest in gardening, music, performance, and the kind of playful social life where she could relax. None of that makes the relationship morally uncomplicated. Margaret was still married. Roddy entered an existing family situation, and secrecy carried consequences for David, Sarah, and everyone required to protect the princess's privacy. But chronology prevents the easier accusation. Roddy didn't create Tony's basement absences. He didn't choose Old House over Sunninghill, begin Tony's earlier relationships, or write the notes Margaret found in her drawers. By September 1973, the Snowdon marriage had endured years of separation under one roof, outside attachments and failed repairs. Roddy arrived after the structure was badly damaged. What he changed was visibility. Tony's other life had largely existed behind work, discretion, and unphotographed doors. Roddy could eventually be pictured beside Margaret, young enough to make the contrast irresistible to editors. The emotional comfort he offered would be turned into public evidence against her. Before those photographs appeared, Margaret passed through a private crisis that's been dangerously misrepresented ever since. The episode occurred in 1974, after Roddy left unexpectedly for a trip abroad. Warwick's account places Margaret under severe strain, not only because Roddy had gone, but against the wider background of Tony's silences and the collapse of her marriage. During that period, she took Mogadon sleeping tablets and was reportedly difficult to rouse the following morning. That part is documented, her intention isn't. Margaret later rejected the claim that she'd tried to end her life. Her explanation to Warwick was direct. "I was so exhausted because of everything that all I wanted to do was sleep." She said she slept through until the following afternoon. Friends also denied it had been a suicide attempt. Their denials shouldn't be transformed into medical proof either. A person's intent during a dangerous episode can't be established decades later by a biographer, a television writer, or an audience. This is where dramatic retellings do real harm. A reconstructed scene can make one interpretation feel settled because viewers watch an actress perform it. But performance isn't documentation. No script can recover Margaret's precise thoughts. What can be concluded is serious enough. Margaret was emotionally exhausted. The quantity of medication left her difficult to wake. Her ladies-in-waiting were sufficiently worried that, while she recovered, they kept Tony from seeing her because they feared his presence would cause further distress. The most accurate wording is simple. Margaret took an excessive quantity of sleeping tablets during a period of acute distress. She later denied suicidal intent. Friends supported her account, while their response showed they regarded her condition as serious. Those three statements can stand together. Certainty would make the incident easier to narrate, but it'd also make the history less honest. Older women's suffering has too often been retold as melodrama, instability, or punishment for romantic choices. Margaret's experience deserves better than that. She survived the crisis. She couldn't control the camera waiting for her on Mystique. In February 1976, the British public finally saw something it believed explained the Snowdon marriage. Princess Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn together on Mystique, relaxed and dressed for swimming. The news of the world placed the photographs before millions of readers. The images weren't explicit. They showed two people at ease in one another's company. But a picture of the Queen's married sister beside a younger man supplied what years of private conflict had not. A simple visual story. Now look at what the camera couldn't prove. It couldn't show Tony disappearing into his basement workroom while Margaret waited upstairs. It couldn't photograph the argument over Sunninghill, the work begun at Old House without her agreement, the hospital bedside occupied by another woman, or the notes left for Margaret to find. It couldn't establish that Tony had been faithful, and it couldn't turn a marriage already damaged for years into a happy one destroyed during a Caribbean holiday. The pictures exposed a relationship. They didn't identify the original cause of the breakdown. The tabloids preferred a cleaner verdict. Margaret was cast as the predatory older woman. Roddy became the toy boy, a label that reduced his work, character, and long relationship with her to his age. She was 45, he was 28. The gap was treated as evidence of something improper in itself. That judgment carried a revealing double standard. Britain had once turned Margaret's relationship with Peter Townsend into a national romance. Townsend was 15 years older than she was, yet his age helped create the image of the experienced war hero and the young princess kept apart by duty. When Margaret was the older partner, age became ridicule. The direction of the difference changed the public story entirely. Tony benefited from another imbalance. His relationships had rarely arrived as one unforgettable photograph. Biographical testimony concerning other women required readers to follow names, dates, and private accounts. Margaret and Roddy could be understood in a glance. An image asks for no footnotes. It reaches the emotions before chronology has time to object. The timing magnified the effect. Readers encountered the holiday scene before they encountered a documented history of the marriage. Once the picture established Margaret as the apparent offender, every later explanation could be dismissed as excuse-making. Tony's affairs were information. Margaret's swimsuit was evidence people believed they'd witnessed themselves. That gave Tony a publicly defensible role. Whatever friends knew about the marriage, the country now saw him as the husband humiliated on a newspaper's front page. His discretion looked like dignity. Margaret's visibility looked like guilt. The photographs didn't end the Snowdon marriage. They made it impossible for the couple to continue hiding that it had already ended. On 19 March 1976, Kensington Palace replaced years of private ambiguity with 39 public words. The announcement said Princess Margaret and the Earl of Snowdon had mutually agreed to live apart. Margaret would perform her public duties without him. It ended with a sentence designed to limit the story. There are no plans for divorce proceedings. Snowdon wasn't in London. He was working in Australia with Lucy Lindsay Hogg, the production assistant with whom de Courcy and later biographers identify his continuing relationship. From abroad, he spoke for the cameras. His expression of sadness was recorded, so we don't need anyone's dramatization. He said he was naturally desperately sad. Then he arranged his response around three concerns. First, understanding for David and Sarah. Second, he wished Margaret happiness. Third, love, admiration, and respect for the Queen Mother, and the royal family. Controlled, courteous, emotionally effective. It placed him exactly where the photographs had prepared, a grieving father and respectful royal relative, responding with dignity to circumstances forced into public view. Margaret's answer survives in a different form. According to later biographical recollection, she watched Snowdon's appearance and said, "I have never seen such good acting." The contrast reveals how far trust had fallen. The public heard sorrow. Margaret believed she was watching performance. Tony may have felt genuine pain and understood how to present it. Those possibilities can coexist. One imbalance shaped the day. Snowdon's television appearance gave him tone, expression, and personal feeling. Margaret offered no matching broadcast. Viewers saw his face and heard his sadness while reading her position through formal palace language. In a visual scandal, the person who appeared composed before the camera held the advantage. At the center were two children old enough to understand that their parents had become national news. David was 14, Sarah was 11. The palace announced a separation between two adults. The country responded as though Margaret herself had been placed on trial, and what followed proved that the trial wasn't over. because now the argument moved from marriage to money. Margaret received an annual civil list payment connected to carrying out official duties. It wasn't simply a private salary. Yet it was public money, and Parliament had every right to examine how it was calculated and spent. That scrutiny didn't begin with Mystique. Hansard records arguments over royal allowances years before the photographs, including sharp criticism from the Labour MP Willie Hamilton during the 1971 civil list debates. The photographs changed the emotional setting. Margaret's holiday, relationship, and public funding became one combined story. Why, critics asked, should taxpayers support a princess whose private conduct they condemned? In 1978, her civil list provision rose from £55,000 to £59,000. Hamilton objected and used language that attacked not only royal expenditure but Margaret personally. Warwick records that the News of the World went further, polling readers on whether Margaret gave the country value for money. That phrase made a human life sound like a balance sheet, and it allowed the newspaper that had exposed her relationship to turn the outrage it created into a test of her public worth. There was a legitimate question underneath the hostility. When public funds meet official duty, transparency matters, but financial scrutiny and moral punishment aren't the same thing. A debate about accounts became a referendum on Margaret as a woman, wife, and sister. Snowdon retained substantial public sympathy despite biographical evidence of his own relationships. His private conduct wasn't attached to an equivalent parliamentary allowance, nor had it been fixed in the national mind by one front-page photograph. Margaret continued carrying out official engagements after the separation. She remained the Queen's sister and a working member of the royal family, even while her approval ratings were argued over in Parliament. Britain had delivered its verdict. Margaret and Tony were still legally married, and neither could remain suspended forever. From March 1976, Margaret and Tony no longer had to perform daily marriage inside the same house. They remained legally husband and wife, but the staircase battles, late returns, and forced domestic encounters were no longer the structure of every week. Separation didn't remove their shared responsibilities. David and Sarah were still their children, and both parents remained involved. Contact continued, even when husband and wife lived apart. Margaret continued her royal work. Roddy remained part of her life, but she announced no intention to marry him. Tony continued his photography, design, and film work. His relationship with Lucy Lindsay Hogg also continued. Why wait 2 years for divorce? Margaret's religious objections hadn't vanished. She still regarded divorce as failure, and there was no new marriage she publicly wished to make. David and Sarah needed stability and privacy. A controlled separation allowed practical arrangements to be settled without forcing an immediate court timetable. There was also something unexpected in delay. Distance removed the constant contest over rooms, work, rank, and presence. Later accounts suggest Margaret and Tony could speak more civilly when they were no longer required to live as spouses. The paradox is telling. Ending daily intimacy created space for a less hostile relationship. One later claim needs careful handling. Lady Glenconner connected Margaret's eventual agreement to divorce with news that Lucy was pregnant. Yet Lucy's daughter Frances was born in July 1979. A year after the divorce became final. That known chronology doesn't support presenting pregnancy as the established cause of proceedings begun in May 1978. Lady Glenconner's recollection may compress events or refer to information that can't now be confirmed. What the record does show is simpler. After 2 years apart, both Snowdons had built lives outside the marriage. The legal bond no longer protected a shared household, stopped either relationship, or spared their children publicity. By 1978, separation had brought them peace. It had also made the legal marriage increasingly difficult to defend. And on one day in May, 39 minutes would finish what 18 years couldn't. On 10 May 1978, Kensington Palace announced the decision the Snowdons had postponed for 2 years. They'd agreed their marriage should be formally ended, and Margaret would begin the necessary legal proceedings. Her spokesman added one limit: the princess had no plan to remarry. The decision wasn't presented as clearing the way for Roddy. It was presented as recognition that the existing marriage could no longer be maintained. 14 days later, on 24 May, the case reached the court. Case number 5684/78. That plain sequence of digits is the legal counterpart to all the banners, music, and crowds of 6 May 1960. Neither Margaret nor Snowdon appeared, Their names were read in Court 44 at the Royal Courts of Justice among 27 other couples whose marriages were also before the court. Contemporary Guardian reporting timed the entire group of 28 cases at less than 2 minutes. No royal procession, no family assembled in rows, no public confrontation between husband and wife. The marriage that had been broadcast to an international television audience was conditionally ended in the time an announcer might need to read a short bulletin. For once, royal status didn't create a ritual. Margaret's case moved through the same list as marriages belonging to people whose names never reached a front page. What Margaret received that day was a decree nisi, a conditional order meaning the court saw no legal reason the divorce shouldn't proceed. A waiting period remained before either party could request the decree absolute. Some anniversary accounts call 24 May the day Margaret and Snowdon were divorced. It wasn't. For 7 more weeks they remained legally married. The contrast with the wedding couldn't have been harsher. In 1960, Westminster Abbey held the vows. The Archbishop of Canterbury conducted the service, and cameras carried Margaret and Tony's promise across the world. In 1978, a court official read their names beside dozens of others. There was dignity in that quiet. No one was required to perform grief, trade accusations, or turn David and Sarah's family history into courtroom entertainment. The court had declared the marriage could end. For 7 more weeks, Margaret remained Snowdon's wife. On 11 July 1978, the decree absolute was issued. The marriage of Princess Margaret and Antony Armstrong-Jones legally ended after 18 years. The paper changed their marital status. It didn't erase the identities built around the union. Margaret remained Her Royal Highness, the Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. Tony remained the Earl of Snowdon. A divorce could end the marriage. It didn't unwind the peerage or remove either parent from the lives of David and Sarah, nor did the decree turn them into strangers. They'd continue to meet around their children and, with daily conflict behind them, later achieved a relationship more cordial than the final years of the marriage. That civility shouldn't be rewritten as proof that the divorce was painless. It shows that 2 people can function better once they stop demanding a shared life neither can sustain. Snowdon remarried on 15 December 1978, 5 months after the decree absolute, taking Lucy Lindsay Hogg as his second wife. Margaret never remarried. Roddy remained part of her life for several more years. The historical label attached to this divorce also needs correcting. It's often called the first royal divorce since Henry VIII. Literally, that's false. Royal and princely divorces occurred between the Tudor reign and 1978. Most relevantly, Princess Victoria Melita of Edinburgh divorced Ernest Lewis, Grand Duke of Hesse, in 1901. Margaret's case was still exceptional. She was the reigning queen's only sister, a senior working royal, and a woman whose earlier public statement about Christian marriage had become part of national memory. Her divorce occurred at the center of the modern British royal family, under mass newspaper and television attention. That's why it felt unprecedented, even when it wasn't without historical precedent. The consequences reached beyond Margaret. Divorce no longer remained something the immediate royal family could discuss only as a threat from the past. A senior princess had passed through separation, court procedure, and final dissolution, while keeping her title, duties, and place within the family. Later royal marriages would fail under different circumstances, but the public had already watched the institution survive this one. There was no victory scene on 11 July. Margaret hadn't escaped into a new marriage. Tony's second wedding still lay ahead. The decree absolute settled legal status, not blame, faith, regret, or memory. The law could identify the day the marriage ended. It couldn't identify the moment Margaret first became lonely inside it. That moment had come years earlier, upstairs, behind warm windows, while the sound of work drifted up from the basement and one staircase separated 2 people who'd once been unable to keep their hands off each other. At my age, I shouldn't be alone. Margaret wasn't describing an empty palace when she said that to Christopher Warwick. She was describing an empty place in her life, one that had been there since long before the divorce, long before Mystique, long before the cameras found her. After seeing the full record, what do you believe? Were Margaret and Tony simply wrong for each other, or did real love collapse under years of absence, pride, and betrayal? Share your view in the comments. And if you value royal history built on verified evidence rather than tabloid gossip, please like this video and subscribe. There are still many royal stories whose accepted versions deserve a closer look.